Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from RAU'S IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of RAU'S IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of the newspaper analysis from a civil services examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss The Hindu Delhi edition dated 11th April 2022. The topics to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. Now before starting the discussion, we have an announcement to make. So the Prelims Compass on Indian Economy has been released on the Amazon. So to buy this copy, you can click on the link provided in the description box below. So now let us begin with our first topic, which has appeared in today's The Hindu edition at page number 6. This topic is a lead article in today's newspaper, which reads India's role in the disordered world. This particular topic gives you in brief the discussion about the changing global order and India's role in it. It also discusses about the challenges which are being associated with the dominance of the major superpowers across the global institutions. The immediate context of this particular article is that recently the Western nations are raising their voice to overthrow the Russia out of the G20 membership. This move has been directly opposed by China, but the important part is that India is going to be the chair of the G20 summit from December 1, 2022. So that is why there is a huge responsibility on the shoulders of India, and it is yet to be seen that what stand India will take in this particular summit. As far as the UPSC's scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic can be directly found in the General Studies paper 2 in the section of International Relations. Moreover, the theme of this particular topic is very important because recently, in past years, you can witness that UPSC is asking the question related to the India's stand, India's dominance in the global order. For example, in 2019 mains, UPSC asked this question. The long sustained image of India as a leader of the oppressed and marginalized nations has disappeared on account of its new-found role in the emerging global order. Now, the basic theme of this question is also talking about the India's role in the changing global order. And that perspective can be reflected in this particular article also. So that is why we will discuss this article in a great depth. First of all, this article talks about the failure of the global institutions. Now, this article mentions the range of issues which yet the global institutions are not being able to successfully deal with. Take, for example, the climate crisis. Since 1990s, it was witnessed that the globe is facing the climate change. The climate change has become a reality. And for this, the global institutions had come up with several international panels, conventions, policies, etc. But still, the climate change is far yet resolved. There were various conventions and protocols, for example, Kyoto, Montreal, Aichi targets, Convention on Migratory Species. Now, all these things were done in order to tackle the climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Yet, the recent IPCC 6th assessment report claims that the world is far away from tackling the climate change. Further, the IPCC report has also said that if the present trend continues, the deals, the commitments which were signed in the Paris summit will not be fulfilled. Similarly, we also witnessed the failure of the global institutions during the COVID pandemic. Whether it was the WHO's role, which was very late in declaring this COVID as a global pandemic, or it was related to the vaccine hoardings. Several poor countries faced the shortage of the vaccines. The research and development took a long period, and that is why we lost several precious lives across the world. Further, as far as the rich versus poor countries debate is concerned, we know that several economic institutions, for example, World Trade Organization, World Bank, IMF, were created in order to reduce this disparity among the rich and poor countries. But recent Oxfam report suggests something else. The report says that the inequality, whether it is in terms of the countries or it is in terms of the people, the individual inequality, the inequality is rising across the demographic sections. Further, as far as the terrorism is concerned, we have also witnessed that whether it is Financial Action Task Force or other organizations, still the terrorism holds a strong hold in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. And the recent example of the failure of the global institution is the practices of invasion and annexation. Now, this invasion and annexation is not restricted to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. It also has to deal with the USA's invasion of, for example, Libya, Egypt, Afghanistan, etc. Whether it was Yemen crisis or it is Crimean crisis, we have seen continuous invasions as well as annexation. And the major issue is that the punitive behavior is very selective in nature. For example, when Russia has invaded Ukraine, there are a lot of talks going around the sanctions which are to be imposed on Russia. But when USA invaded other countries, we didn't witness a similar response. So that is why it feels that the global institutions which were dealt, which were strengthened, which were built with the spirit of democracy are not truly democratic in nature. So these examples showcase that the global institutions have failed their responsibility. Now comes the second part of this particular article. The author of this article elaborates on the evolution of the undemocratic structure. It also gives the historical significance that how these organizations were formed. Further, it also discusses that how these organizations have failed. The structure and composition of these organizations are so fragile that from time to time, on the basis of political agenda, the structure, working, as well as composition of these organizations change. So let us discuss this very perspective in detail. First of all, this article says that we all of know that after the World War, the post-World War II era, we saw the rise of the bodies like United Nations, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, as well as IMF. Now, these organizations were built in order to reduce the poverty and inequality. But as we have discussed till now, that several international reports claim that poverty and inequality has risen further. The gap between the rich and poor has risen. Now, another important objective of these organizations was to ensure peace and prosperity. And for this, a specially dedicated body, that is United Nations Security Council, was built. But as far as the structure of the United Nations Security Council is concerned, we know that there are 5 countries who hold veto power. And most of the time, these 5 countries have used their veto power to protect their own parochial nationalist interests. Further, we also witnessed that in the post-World War II era, there was a power struggle to have a control over the nuclear arsenal. And these very countries believed that the nuclear power should not percolate to the other countries because those countries are not wise enough in order to control the nuclear weapons. And this belief still holds the ground. These countries still feel that the other countries do not have that capability and wisdom to hold the nuclear arsenal with them. That is why they always talk about the nuclear weapon free world, but when it comes to destroy their own nuclear weapons, that enthusiasm gets reduced. Further, if we go by the structural dominance in these bodies, because we all know that in bodies like World Bank, IMF, the voting rights are given as per the share which individual country contributes to those bodies. So if you analyze this dominance in the context of the democratic spirit, it gives us a conclusion that the decision making rights are based on the property rights, and this is basically a feudal mindset. This is not a democratic mindset. So if some country, for example, let's say USA, talks about the universal adult franchisee, voting to every individual, equal voting rights to every person, then why this equal voting rights are not provided to the every country, every member in the bodies like World Bank? And next comes the fragility in the structure of various organizations, the fragile membership, which is based on the political agendas. For example, in 1976, G7 was born. and it signaled the non-communist countries are coming together to discuss the economic concerns which are relevant for the whole world. But this period also witnessed the rise of inflation and recession across the globe, and as a result, OPEC was formed. Further, Russia was also given the membership of the G7 grouping, which signaled the East-West cooperation is growing. But in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, it was thrown out of the G7 membership. Similarly, in 1999, in the backdrop of the Asian financial crisis, G20 was born. And now, as in the context we have discussed, the Western countries like USA are raising their voices to suspend the membership of Russia from the G20 also. So if you closely analyze this particular part, we can see that the basic objectives with which these organizations were created is not yet fulfilled. And the global organizations are also dealing with the issues of political leanings, which in turn gets reflected in the fragility of their structure and membership. In continuation with this article also talks about that these organizations, the present global structure, the present global order has given rise to the inequality. A continuous feeling is getting developed across the world that the free market economy is not in consonance with the principles of democracy. There is a conflict between capitalistic tendencies and the democratic spirit, because the capitalistic tendencies are based on the idea of profit making, and the basic root of this profit making is money, and this money is the source of all power. So naturally, the country, the members which will be having the greater monetary strength with them will be having the major dominance across the global politics. And that is where the problem starts. And as the outcome of this problem, you can also witness, you can also analyze that in recent years, there has been a continuous rise in the nationalist parties across the globe. The basic reason of rising of nationalist parties is that now the citizens of different countries feel that their interest somehow was getting reduced because of the principles of free market economy. Let us take an example of employment. Now, with the idea of the free market economy, let's say that Indians are free to move to USA and gain employment, and vice versa. The population, the section of one country can go to the other country in order to have better employment opportunities. But then the host countries, for example, the citizens of the USA in this particular case, will feel that their domestic employment opportunities are being snatched away from them by some foreigners. So that is the issue, that in order to protect their own interests, they are favoring the nationalist parties. Now, this trend is true in countries like India, US, as well as other countries also. Further, in order to give a counter to the capitalism, there has been a continuous rise of the socialist ideologies also. Because now many sections of population believe that socialism is based on the idea of equity, and it is not based on the idea of power struggle. However, in this changing global order and the rising complex global order, it is important that we should know that what can India do. The first important thing is that India must take steps to reform the multilateral institutions. For example, United Nations Security Council. India has been raising its voice since many years that UNSC must be reformed in order to grant a greater regional representation, reforming the structure of the veto power as well as permanent membership. And for this, India is continuously cooperating with countries like Japan, Brazil, etc. The second important thing is that India must not bow down under the Western pressure, and it must exercise its own strategic autonomy. India must weigh its own national interests as well as the moral commitments, and that balance must be ensured. The realistic foreign policy is the need of the hour, which is based on the principles of national interest first. Third important step is that India must focus on developing the South-South cooperation. This South-South cooperation will reduce the inequality across the globe and will strengthen the voice of the developing countries. And that is the only way through which we can have a multipolar world and a power balance. And for this, India must use its soft diplomatic skills, for example, people to people contact, cultural functions, infrastructural support, medical support to African as well as Latin American countries. So these are the broader ways which India must focus upon aggressively in order to have a better balanced world. So this was the complete article which we have discussed. Now let us revise this article in brief once again. Initially, we discussed about the failure of the global institutions in terms of tackling the climate crisis, vaccine hoardings, rich versus poor gap, inequality and terrorism, and the recent invasions as well as annexations. We saw that how the global institutions have failed in all these aspects. Next, we discussed about the evolution of the undemocratic architecture in the global powers setup. We discussed that how after the post-World War II, various organizations were established in order to reduce the poverty and inequality and increase the peace and prosperity. But the structure of these organizations was decided in such a way that the power dominance remained in the control of certain few countries. Then we saw that how the political agendas lead to fragility in the structure and composition of these organizations. And because of all these factors, we also witnessed the changing perspectives of the global population for the aspects like capitalism, socialism, nationalist parties, free market economy, etc. And in this changing and increasing complex global order, in the last we discussed that what are those broader strategies or principles which India can take in order to make the more balanced world. Now we will move towards our next articles. Now I have combined two important articles from today's The Hindu Daily edition. The first article has appeared on page number 7, which reads The Best Chance for Architecture. And the second article has appeared on page number 12, which reads India's learning poverty has shot up. Now these two articles are linked together because this particular article is talking about learning poverty, which is somehow related to learning outcomes. We will discuss what exactly is the concept of learning poverty and how is it measured. And in this very article, the author talks about the national education policy. Now, because national education policy aims to improve the learning outcomes, that is why I have clubbed these two articles and we will deal with both these articles together. So let us carry forward our discussion and first we'll look at what is meant by learning poverty. So learning poverty is measured at the end of the primary education, that is at 10 years, and it is related to the learning outcomes. The learning poverty indicators, as you can see here, combines the concept of schooling as well as learning at the end of primary education, and it is built on the indicators of reading proficiency and school enrollment. Now these two things are important in measuring the learning poverty. One is the reading proficiency and other is the school enrollment. Further, the important thing is that this learning poverty is also an important element of the Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Now let us see that how this indicator is measured. Let us suppose that we have 10 number of students, that is from 1 to 10. Now out of these 10 children in this specific age gap, let us assume that 2 children are out of the school. Now these 2 children are out of the school, that means that both these children will be considered as non-proficient, correct? Now the remaining 8 students are enrolled in the primary education. Out of these 8 students, 25%, that is again 2 students are not proficient. That means that despite the fact that they are enrolled into the primary education, they are not proficient enough to read some basic stuff. So reading proficiency is something that whether the student is able to read some basic lines, paragraphs, phrases or stories or not. So 2 students are not proficient. The remaining 6 students are proficient enough. So now these 6 students out of 10, that is 60%, will be considered as proficient. Now these 2 students which are out of the school and these 2 students which were in the school but not enough proficient enough to read something will be considered as learning poor. That means 40%, that is 2 plus 2, 4 out of these 10 students are poor in learning. So that is why the definition of the learning poverty has to relate with reading proficiency as well as the school enrollment. Now, if you have clearly understood the concept of learning poverty, we shall now move towards the national education policy. But before coming to the national education policy, we shall look at the important constitutional provisions which deal with education. First of all, right to education, which is a fundamental right provided to all citizens between the age of 6 to 14 years under Article 21A. And second is the gender specific, because the Article 15 says that there shall be no discrimination on the basis of gender. That is why it allows the education to the women under Article 15. Article 25 and 28 provides for the freedom, the fundamental rights for the religious education in certain types of institutions. And on the other hand, the minority education rights are protected under the Article 29. So that means that education finds its relevance in many articles under the sections of fundamental right. Now come to the directive principles of state policy. Article 46 provides for the education. It lays down the responsibility on the states to provide for the education of SC, ST categories as well as other weaker sections to be recognized by the state governments. Next comes the fundamental duty part, and Article 51A lays down the fundamental duty on parents to ensure that their children are provided with the due education. There are certain other directives which are outside the scope of DPSPs. For example, Article 350A, which again lays down the responsibility on the government to provide the instructions in the mother tongue to the children in primary level. So that means that our constitution in many areas have provided adequate provisions in order to boost the educational levels of our students. And in this very regard, we should know the important provisions of the national education policy. First of all, it aims to provide universal education. The universalization of education in the national education policy deals with two important things. One is that it aims to cover preschool to the secondary level of education, integrating all the levels of school education. Second, it has put for itself an ambitious target to improve the gross enrollment ratio to 100% in schools by 2030. The second important thing is that it aims to replace the present 10 plus 2 system by 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system. Now what is this 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 system? Now present day system is that education up to 10th class is integrated and then 11th and 12th class is in a separate compartment. Now this education policy aims to compartmentalize education in this age group, that is 3 to 8, 8 to 11 years, 11 to 14 years and 14 to 18 years. Now this is a more scientific classification as far as the age and the learning curve of a student is concerned. The more important thing is that it has taken the age group of 3 to 6, which is the preschool levels, and that is why it integrates the preschool to the secondary level of education. It aims to provide 12 years of schooling, and it also ensures to integrate 3 years of Anganwadis. Similarly, the next important component is the new curriculum. The new curriculum especially focuses on the foundational numeracy as well as literacy skills. And in order to boost the skill development of our students, this education policy integrates the vocational education with our formal schooling systems, and it starts the vocational education from class 6th. And next is to boost the capability and capacity of our teachers. It strengthens the comprehensive framework for teacher education and lays down the eligibility criteria of 4 years of integrated B.Ed course for a teacher to teach in a school. Next, it also aims to increase the public investment up to 6% of the GDP as well as it aims also to provide free higher education to 50% of all the students. So these are the important provisions and objectives of the National Education Policy which you should be aware of. So under this session we have dealt with the poverty gap, the concept as well as the mechanism to measure the learning poverty. Next we read about the constitutional provisions associated with providing the education. And in the last, we discussed some of the important features of our national education policy. Now, moving towards our next topic, this topic is in relation to the care economy. So, the context of this very topic is that the care economy of India, that is, whether it is in a formal sector or might be in informal sector, is not given enough attention with respect to the monetary benefits or gender sensitization. But to understand this particular context, you need to know that what exactly is meant by care economy, what is its concept, and why is it being said that it is not given enough attention as far as India is concerned. So that is why today we will look at the concept of the care economy, its meaning, need, issues involved, as well as the related ILO convention. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic is an intersection of General Studies Paper 2 as well as General Studies Paper 3. In General Studies Paper 2, you have a section of social justice which further has a micro section of issues relating to the development and management of social sector, issues related to health, education and human resources. Similarly, in General Studies Paper 3, you have a section of economic development and a micro section of inclusive growth and issues arising from it. So going forward, let us now look at the meaning of the care economy. First of all, as the name is suggesting you, the word care. What do you mean by the word care? Care economy refers to the time spent on the unpaid care for members of the household or communities. For example, if you are taking care of some senior citizens in your house or in your locality, but you are not being paid off, then it will refer to the care economy. Because you are dedicating your time and time is money. So that means you are putting some value in the economy, but you are not getting paid. So that is basically the care economy. However, there is other meaning of the care economy also, that is, it also refers to the time spent to make up for the spatial deficiencies in the public infrastructure including health, energy, water or sanitation workers. So ultimately, the elements which are working together in an economic system with an objective to take care of refers to the care economy. Then what is the need of the care economy? Why care economy is so important for India? First of all, it is one of the important tool to increase the female labor force participation rate. Because these studies suggest that whether it is formal sector or informal sector, the highest proportion of the care economy workers is with women. So that is why if you are boosting your care economy, if you are formalizing your care economy, there it will have a direct bearing on the female labor force participation rate. Second is, it can be helpful to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 8 by 2030. The third is that presently the care economy in India is highly informal in nature. And the informal sector is known for the encroachment of worker rights, exploitation as well as other issues involved. And that is why we need to have a clear-cut data in order to make certain dedicated policies for care economy, and that is why the formalization of this sector is required. Next is the social aspect, that because now we know that women share the maximum burden of the care economy, the recognition of female efforts at the household level should increase. And that is basically the social aspect. If the women's effort is recognized in monetary terms in our homes, their empowerment will increase because then they will be having some role in the family's decision making. So that is why it recognizes the female efforts at household level. And further, with the increase in formalization as well as income, it is expected that the consumption expenditure will also rise, which in turn make a virtuous cycle of economic growth. But there are certain issues involved in this whole ecosystem. First is limited maternity leave coverage. Now, how will we formalize this sector? The challenge is that almost 90% of the employed women in this sector are having informal type of employment. Second, why we are talking only about maternity leave? Why we are not talking about the paternity leave? Because if there is no paternity leave, directly or indirectly, again the burden of raising the child falls on to the mother. But in India, even in the highly organized sectors, we do not have the concepts of paternity leave. So, how can we expect the paternity leave to percolate down to the informal care economy ecosystem? Next, the crèche facilities are also very limited. Now, this is a fact that because of our type of social setup in which we live, the child raising responsibilities are mainly on women. So if the women are also working, it becomes a double burden for them, and that is why we require crèche facilities. But again, the harsh reality is that these facilities are also very limited. The next challenge is that the domestic workers also face several issues in having the dignified work conditions because the sectors are again informal and around 70% of the domestic workers are female. The female rights are exploited to such an extent that many cases are also related to the sexual harassment at workplaces. And then the budget allocation is so poor that India spends less than 1% of its GDP on the care economy. So these are the various issues involved in the care economy ecosystem of our country. Now we'll come to the ILO conventions part. International Labour Organization's 189th convention deals with the domestic workers. India is a signatory to this convention but has not ratified it yet, and therefore all the provisions which are there in this convention becomes non-binding for India. First is that domestic workers be given daily and weekly rest hours. Payment must meet the minimum wage requirements. They must be given the right to choose the place where they live and spend their leave. And the states are required to take protective measures against the violence against such persons and are required to enforce a minimum age for the employment. So all these provisions are basically in order to protect the workers' right and more importantly the human rights. Now whether any worker is in the formal IT sector, whether he is an engineer or some other person is in informal sector. Now because both are the citizens of this country and both are human, and that is why both require the equal protection as far as the worker rights are concerned. And that is why we have discussed the major dimensions associated with the concept of care economy. Now, care economy can also be asked as a term in the preliminary examination, or an analytical question on the issues, needs, concept, meaning can be asked in your mains examination. Now, this topic has appeared on the text and the context page. This topic is mainly relevant from the preliminary examination's point of view because it mentions an important term, a non-place. Every year in preliminary examinations, there are around 1 to 2 questions which are based on certain specific term in news. So that is why this term has appeared in today's newspaper, and hence we should know what exactly is meant by the non-place. So this term was introduced in a book that is Non-Places, Introduction to an Anthropology of Supermodernity by RAU'S. According to him, non-places are the temporary spaces that thrive under the capitalism, which include holiday resorts, hotel chains, and supermarkets. To better understand this specific term, let us see that what are places. Just think about some place. Let's say place is some city. For example, let's say Chandigarh. Now, when you hear about Chandigarh, the first thing which comes to your mind is a planned city. Similarly, let us take another example. Let's say Haridwar, or let's say Agra. Now, these cities have an identity of historical or religious towns. So, according to this person, the place is something which has its own identity, and therefore, the non places are those areas which do not have their own identity. They are ahistorical in nature, they do not have any identity, and that is why they are temporary spaces. For example, if you think about some mall or you think about some hotels, so the people who are going to the mall or hotels all are the customers. They have unique identity. They have similar identity. There is no variation in it. Similarly, the other areas, for example, refugee camps, shanty houses, torn down settlements that proliferate under inhuman conditions also can be considered as non-places because again they thrive under the capitalistic economic setup, but they do not have their identity of their own. And hence this person further says that non-places are tied intrinsically to the super modernity or a late capitalistic phenomena that is characterized by an excess of information, space and events. Further again, as we have discussed, that RAU'S says that these non-places are ahistorical and have impersonal nature. That means that they have a cosmopolitan uniform identity. These are the non-places. So now is the time for the question of the day. The question from yesterday's DNS is in relation to the IDate Commission, and you were asked to find the options which dealt with the IDate Commission subject. Option A was that the commission was set up to suggest the improvements in the academic standards and quality of higher education. Option B was reviewing the Competition Act of 2002. Option C was restructuring the Central Water Commission and Central Groundwater Board. And option D was suggest appropriate measures in respect of the denotified and nomadic tribes. So yes, option D is the correct answer. The question from today's DNS is in relation to the ILO convention. The question is, ILO Convention 189 deals with which amongst the following? Option A, child labor. Option B, equal wages. Option C, domestic workers. Or option D, industrial workers.